Where are our consultants?
Welcome to the October 15th, 2024 regular meeting of the San Ramon Planning Commission. We call to order at 6 p.m. Okay. Item 2, the roll call. Can the recording secretary please conduct the roll call?
Commissioner Ahmed,
Present.
Commissioner Alpert,
Here.
Commissioner Wallace,
I'm here.
Vice Chair Curtis,
Present.
and Chair Kuznick.
I am here. Thank you. All right, item 3 is the Pledge of Allegiance. If you all stand and join us in the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Item number 4 on the agenda, public comments or written communications. At this time, members of the public may address the Planning Commission on any item not already included in tonight's agenda. If you would like to speak, please fill out a speaker card located in the back of the room and submit it to the recording secretary. We will not be taking any public comment via Zoom. Do we have any public comment on the non-agendized items?
No.
Yes.
Can I have this card?
Please come up. Come on up.
Larry Brickle.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for your plan. This is relevant to the Climate Action Plan, though not directly on the agenda. As a planning commission, we are looking to the future and upcoming plans for the community. However, there are also the issue of the present and near-term future for our community. The state of California is mandating the end of sales of gas water heaters by 2027. This means the need to move forward on home electrification. Most houses in San Ramon currently have legacy 100 amp services, which creates a challenge for this. Upgrading to 200 amps will cost more than $5,000 for most homeowners. And in our specific case, our street has underground utilities, which is the further expense of tearing up the street. This is a large sum to most people. Managed panels such as the Smart Switch, which is a specific brand, or Span.io, which is another brand of a managed panel, will alleviate this problem and allow more appliances on a 100 amp service. San Ramon assumes right now that all devices in a home will be on at the same time. This usually is not true. A managed panel such as a Span.io or Smart Switch, plus others, can be programmed to prevent this. For example, while running your electric stove, the car charger and electric clothes dryer would be disabled, therefore maintaining your capacity within the 100 amp limit. This is just one example. These things are programmable by the homeowner's priority. We need to expedite the process to get these devices approved as soon as possible and not wait for the cap to be approved. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I don't have any other speaker cards
Okay.
for this item.
Thank you. So at this time, we will close the public comment on non-agendized items. Thank you. Yeah. Go to item number 5. Additions and revisions. Do we have any changes, additions or revisions? Seeing none, we will go on to item 6, the consent calendar. 6.1, minutes of the Planning Commission regular meeting, September 17th, 2024. Do we have a motion to approve?
I'll move to accept the minutes from the September 17, 2024 Planning Commission meeting.
Is there a second?
Second, please.
Great. So we have a motion to accept the consent calendar or the consent items. Okay, and We have a 4-1 vote. The motion passes. Thank you. Item number 7, continued items after the closing of public hearing. There are none. Item number 8, continued items. Open the public hearing. There are none. Item number 9, public hearing, new items. There are none. Item 10, non-public hearing action items. Okay, recommending the city council adoption of the objective design and development standards. Ms. Yee.
Okay, well, thank you very much and good evening. I have a brief PowerPoint presentation that I'll quickly run through. The first couple of slides here, just a quick refresher on what the objective design and development standards are. Ultimately, the city is meeting our obligations under state law and specifically the Housing Accountability Act to adopt standards that are not personal or subjective in nature. We have an opportunity to adopt objective design and development standards that will provide certainty for processing of development applications. It does establish measurable and quantifiable designs that ultimately will result in the increase of housing production. And so the city is set out to look at our zoning regulations and our current design standards and updating language and removing subjectivity from our zoning ordinance, and have come up with this draft document that's attached to your staff report this evening that sets a standard in place for how to review applications that come before the city for residential and mixed-use projects. The housing element does direct the city to adopt the objective design and development standards. It does require that the standards are going to be prepared in a way that will be compatible with the character of the surrounding neighborhood. And it does also direct that the city will be reviewing the objective design standards every 4 years during our housing element cycle. And so this is probably not the last time you'll see the objective design standards before this commission. In the staff report, it does talk about the applicability of the objective design standards. As I mentioned, there's a number of different provisions in state law that identify what a qualifying project are, projects that are considered by right or subject to SB 330 applications. Any of those types of qualifying projects, we would be applying the objective design standards to. To date, we've had 3 study sessions with the Planning Commission starting in February and the last one in August. We did also take the objective design standards to the Architecture Review Board for their comments in August. And we've noted that the project is exempt from CEQA. Our last conversation with the Planning Commission was regarding making sure that the standards and the graphics are easy to understand. And so we just have some examples here of how one would apply the objective standards. For example, rooftop decks, there are some very specific requirements. If somebody is proposing a rooftop deck, there are requirements for when the structure is over 4 stories or more, that the deck be placed at least 1 foot away from the edge. The surface of that deck has to be either finished with hardscape and landscaping or a combination of that. For safety purposes, you would also need to make sure that any railings or other improvements by the California Building Code are met. And then the materials that are used to construct that deck would be 1 or more materials that are found on the primary building. And so this graphic will show we're responding to, if somebody is looking for a graphical depiction of what a rooftop deck would look like once it's over 4 feet tall, 4 or more stories tall, the deck would be placed at least 1 foot away from the structure's edge. It would also be finished in both hardscape and softscape in this depiction that would meet the requirements of the objective design standards. And then materials that are used on the building, whether that's stucco or concrete or tiles, that's something that would also be reflected on the rooftop deck as well. Similarly, for step backs and recesses, these types of the standards require that structures that are over 35 feet in height have to follow at least one of these techniques. So it gives the option for the designer to either do a step back or add additional setback on the side and rear yard area. So for example, here, building that's over 35 feet in height, you would take a minimum 5-foot step back on the upper floors. There's at least one step back that's required with a minimum of 5 feet, or the applicant could decide to increase the side and rear yard setbacks, and that's based on, for every foot of height that's beyond 35 feet. So this is an example of, giving developers options to meet some of the standards that we are adopting, but it gives you an opportunity to have differences in your projects. You don't have to follow the same standard for in that design. So tonight, we're recommending that the commission receive the report, and then if there's any public comments, to receive those as well. And then we have attached Resolution 07-24 to your staff report this evening that would recommend City Council adoption of the objective design standards. And then upon council approval, we would begin implementing those and applying those to qualifying projects. So with that, that concludes my staff report. If there's any questions, I can certainly take those now, unless you'd like to have me come up after public comment.
Do we have any clarifying questions before we open the public comment? Questions? Yes, Commissioner Wallace.
Well, I have a few questions. I'm going to start at the title, which is Standards for Review of Qualifying Multifamily and Residential Mixed-Use Developments. Let's suppose that Bob wants to build 25 single-family homes on 5 acres. Would that project be subject to these guidelines?
So for the projects that are typically considered qualifying projects, they generally do not include single-family residential development. These apply to multifamily. So basically anything that's attached typically is considered a qualifying project.
Okay, so let's suppose Bob, instead of his 25 single-family homes, wants to put in row homes, which are not physically attached, but they're just, it's lot line to lot line. Would that be included as a qualifying project?
So we have included on the first page what multifamily developments apply, and it includes I think it's number 4 or 5 on that list as row houses. The way that we typically see row houses is they are attached units that are physically attached. And so if they are considered an attached unit, we would apply the objective design standards to that row house development.
I'm sorry, if they were attached or
If they
not
are-
attached?
If they are attached, yes.
Okay, and if they're not?
If they're not attached and they're separated, they would not be considered multifamily. And
Okay.
so objective design standards would not apply.
Okay. On packet page 16, you talk about the interplay between the objective design standards and existing zoning regulations, including the specific plans. One of the terms you use is an, quote, applicable zoning district, close quote. That's not defined elsewhere in either the staff report or the resolution. I'm assuming what you're referring to is standards that appear in our zoning ordinance for mixed use or multifamily buildings, things like that.
Yeah, that's correct. It's probably applicable zoning standards
Okay.
as opposed to districts.
Okay. Now, a little different question is how the objective design standards are designed to meet with specific plans. Now, in practical terms, we have three specific plans, two of which are, I think, specific only in name only, which is the West Side and the Northwest Specific Plan. But as you know, the San Ramon Village Specific Plan has very detailed design and development standards. What you're proposing to do in the design standards is say the more restrictive, if there's a conflict between the two, shall apply. And my question is, why should the objective design standards take precedence over design standards that were specifically done for a specific area that are contained in a specific plan?
So I probably just need to clarify that. In the staff report, it does talk about that there are objective design standards that were adopted in the San Ramon Village specific plan, and we would actually not apply these particular objective design standards to the San Ramon Village specific plan because those do have adopted design standards. And so I think we'll just need to mirror that language from the staff report to this particular section.
Yeah, the section I'm referring to is on packet page 16. It's it's number 3, where it says where a conflict occurs between the requirements of the ODDS and other city requirements, the more restrictive provisions shall apply. Now, is it your interpretation of the ODDS that was been drafted that conflict does not apply to a specific plan, specifically no pun intended, the San Ramon Village specific plan?
That's correct, because the San Ramon Village specific plan was adopted by ordinance, and so that ordinance will continue to, the objective design standards that are in that specific plan will continue to remain.
Okay. Next question. The ODDS, you're assuming or presuming or planning on sending to the city council for at least an initial review, I think, next month. Until the time the city adopts the design standards, first of all, are any housing projects that have filed for a preliminary application, will they be subject to the objective design standards should they file a final application after the design standards are adopted?
My understanding is that if an application is filed, a preliminary housing application with the city, and we've accepted it as complete in terms of the preliminary housing application has paid their fees, submitted all of the documentation identifying what the project includes, then if these objective design standards are in place after the filing of that preliminary housing development application, these standards would not apply to those projects.
Okay, so hypothetically, if Bob files his application today, the city adopts the design standards 2 weeks, and then a week after the city council acts, the preliminary application is deemed complete, then the standards would apply even though the preliminary application was filed prior to the adoption of the standards?
It would not. So let me just make sure I'm clear. Under SB 330, a preliminary housing application vests any of the standards that are in place at the time that application is accepted as complete, that preliminary housing application.
So, okay, so
and
it's
so-
not the filing of the application, it's the stamp that says thou shalt be complete.
Wow.
It's the filing of the application, but we generally do not take the application unless they've paid the fee and they've provided all the supplemental information to make the application complete.
The effective date of the PhD application is the date that is actually submitted to the city.
That's what I thought, okay. Now, a little more nuanced question is City Walk. Are the ODDS standards applicable to City Walk because we have a development agreement, I believe, with the developer?
The development agreement vests the City Walk design guidelines, and they have their own guidelines adopted. So I would say no in that case.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. Next question. On packet pages 18 through 19, you have a discussion of community amenities. And part of it is that you list the amenities or examples of amenities like tot lots, things like that, and specify how many amenities should be provided based on the size of the unit or the project. There's nothing more specific than a description of tot lot or community meeting room and stuff like that. Now, is that consistent with the concept of a objective design standard?
Well, we haven't defined tot lot or a community meeting room. Certainly if the plans identify and are labeled as a tot lot and does include a tot lot elements, whether it's a small or large play structure, that would qualify. But no, we haven't defined specifically what a tot lot or what the minimum sizes are for a community meeting room.
Right, and I can understand why. To a certain extent, things like sizes depend on the size of the project. So I would guess that in this particular part of the objective standards, what you're really relying on is the objective good faith of developer to meet these criteria.
To a certain degree, yes. I think unless we want to go into very specific detail about what a tot lot, or at least what the city considers a tot lot or community meeting room, is it simply just a room, or does that room have to be X sizes? And
Right, no, I understand. There's I think a qualitative difference between trying to program out for a developer how big a community meeting room should be as opposed to setbacks in the building itself. It seems they're two different things.
Right.
Last question. Do you have the pack in front of you?
I do.
Okay, if you could turn to page 26, please. Okay, that has figure XX, which obviously is a placeholder, and it refers to mixed-use structure standards. Do you see that?
Yes.
I think that should be for actually multifamily housing, shouldn't it? Because it's discussion of the multifamily, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So the photo probably repeats in the mixed use section. It's
Yeah, that's correct.
The label should.
Yeah, so just need to change the label. Okay. That's all the questions I had.
Thank you, Commissioner Wallace. Gentlemen, other questions? Okay. Commissioner Alpert?
Thank you. First question, it calls out four-year review on the objective design standards. Is that a hard and fast rule, no more frequent, or can it be modified if the need arises?
It certainly can. We made that commitment in the housing element program that we would revisit the objective design standards at least once during this housing element cycle. And so potentially it will be shorter than 4 years, given that we're already a year into our housing element.
There was a public comment that we got that was asking or suggesting that we should integrate all of the references into this document as opposed to references to the external documents. Do you have an opinion on why we're taking this approach versus, because there's a lot of references here that you have to keep track of. And the specific session, of course, was around parks and open space, but it was references to those ordinances or codes. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think at least in terms of staff's opinion, oftentimes standards can change. And we take up edits to various different documents over time because our goal is to try to not have competing or different documents that could potentially be superseded by another, action that's taken in the near distant future. It's simply easier to refer to those documents that are in place. And some of those documents we don't really have control over, at least in terms of our department subdivision ordinance or building code references oftentimes can change over time and during the course of these when we plan to re-review these standards. And so it's easier for us to refer out to them and have somebody look at those standards that are in place at the time that they submit the application rather than trying to pinpoint a point in time on what those standards are now, because they could potentially change if the city were to make edits to those documents.
Okay, that makes sense. I didn't see, or maybe I did and missed it or forgot, references to specifically to, like, for example, the bicycle master plan or the walking district master plan. To the extent they're objective standards there, is there anything in this document that might refer back to those plans versus zoning code or municipal ordinances?
So there isn't a specific reference to the bicycle master plan or the walking district per se. Other than that, if there are standards that have been adopted, that whichever documents take precedent or are more restrictive than that document would provide the standards in those cases. Some of the standards that you'll find in the city's bike master plan are really more sometimes guidelines or goals that the city has, and oftentimes they're not designed as objective standards. And so these really are meant to be more specific to private residential development as opposed to standards that would apply perhaps along the city right of way or street, which is really what the bike master plan and the walking district is focused on, is really more on the public right of way.
Okay, so right now they're working on an update to the bicycle master plan. So if they were to adopt hard standards, those would then be in effect then for, say they have something that says bicycle racks and thou shalt have, unambiguous standard objective. Would that somehow play into a future development, even under multifamily? That's what I'm kind of.
I would say that normally, at least for the hierarchy of how we apply our standards, we have the zoning ordinance that is specific to number of bicycle parking spaces and the type of bicycle structures that bikes might need. And we typically follow that as a hierarchy of guiding residential development. And our document does refer back to the zoning ordinance. And so if the bike master plan necessitated the city update our zoning ordinance for bicycle standards, because it refers back to the zoning ordinance, this document would cover any changes that may be required of the bike
That makes
master
sense.
plan.
And then my last question, could you just comment objective design standards versus waivers and concessions that sometimes pop up on these projects where the developer wants to take advantage of something? Are any of these objective design standards fair game for requests on, maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but are they all eligible for a concession or a waiver?
The way that state law is written as far as density bonus is that any development standards, including objective standards that are adopted, are waivable as long as you can make the findings to allow for the waiver or concession. I would say that other than density range, what we've been told by the state is that any other development or design standards are fair for the applicant to request a waiver from. And so whether that's height or step backs or rooftop decks, and using a different material on the rooftop deck that we may require, those are all standards that can be waived if they can make a reasonable request for why they need a waiver from them.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, I have just a couple of quick items. The one that let me get to the page, apologize. This is on page 23. Again, talking about the pedestrian, this is item number 4, sub-item A, pedestrian and bicycle circulation, where it says a bicycle parking rack on the capacity for a minimum of 2 bikes shall be installed at the access points along trails. And I guess when I read this the first time, what came to mind was, how are we defining a trail?
So this trail isn't, this is on on private residential development projects. And so if within a project area, if that private development included a trail within that residential development, the bicycle parking would apply to that project. It's not meant to be public trails
Okay.
that the city has control over, and those have its own separate standards as far as trail bike parking.
Okay. So for example, as we've seen the possibility in the orchards where there's already the existing perimeter trail, as that becomes a development, that would be considered a trail.
Correct, right.
Okay.
That's a much larger scale project that potentially could have trails that are designed within that project, and this would apply in that case.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that. And the only other thing that I caught, and it's really small, page 21, parking letter B, the end of the second line there, I think you have a spelling mistake. It says complies with the parking R lighting. I think it means parking area.
Thank you.
So, okay. Anything else from the commission here?
I have one follow-up question to one you raised about the bicycle racks. If a development is proposed that is adjacent to, say, the Iron Horse Trail, would the requirement for providing bicycle racks on the project property apply to the Iron Horse Trail?
I think it would depend on if the project doesn't, if there's access to the trail from the development. Let's say that project is completely enclosed and doesn't have access to the trail. The trail, if it's not on that private development, would not, this particular standard would not apply to that project. It's only if the trail is on within the project development area.
Well, let me give you an example. Let's suppose the project backs up to the Iron Horse Trail, and either the developer provides an access gate to the trail, or there is simply no gate between, or no fence between the Iron Horse Trail and the project. As the ODDS are written, would the developer have to place bike racks on their property next to the access point to the Iron Horse Trail?
So the way that it's worded, installed at access points along trails, in this particular instance, if the trail is not on the property, but it's an access point to the trail, then we would require that they apply that standard. But if there's no access to the trail, then it would be difficult to put bike racks.
Well, you could
that
put them, they
can't
probably
lead
wouldn't do any
to-
good though.
Yes, that won't lead to
Okay.
the trail.
All right, thank you.
Seeing any of the questions, I'm going to open the public comment on this. Do we have any speaker cards on this item?
I don't have any speaker cards, but we received written public comment from Jim Blick's staff on this item.
Okay, very good. All right, I'm going to close the public comment. Thank you very much. Okay, so we do have a resolution to look at. Yes.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment. And it came up with the related apartments in the park that was next to it. There was quite a bit of discussion about the EVA parking next to the building. And they had to shift the park around a little bit because they needed to be able to allow a fire truck to have a tall, hook and ladder to park next to it. And the observation I had was on at least the diagram on packet page 26. It appeared to me that that's sort of misleading because we have cars parking right in front of the buildings and the building looked like it was probably tall enough to require EVA access.
Mm.
So one comment might be that we might want to, if there's EVA access next to it, that's fine. It just looked a little bit like you could park do stuff right next to the building when in the related apartments, they had to actually adjust in order to meet the fire department standards,
I can comment briefly on that. In many cases, there's a road design that is designed for aerial access. It has to do with the distance from the travel lanes that are available to fire trucks to the building itself. What tends to interfere with that access is tree plantings. So you have to make sure you have the right spacing and setbacks for those, and in some cases, parking. But it's a different situation because there's no actual road where that park is, but yet there's still the need for aerial access
Okay,
to
okay.
that project.
Okay, and then the second, thank you for clarifying. And then the second sort of related comment is I remember the architect at the ARB, they had a lot of discussion about what that material ought to be, so that it could support the weight of the product, but also make it not just asphalt or not just, so it could be sort of it could be usable until the fire truck needs to drive on it and then, all bets are off. Is there any value in having any standards related to the material or any possible way to include something that says we don't just want asphalt next to the building, that it should be, I think they're trying to, I think using grass or something softer, made it a landscape element more than just a road,
Yeah, it's actually come up several times in projects with fire access standards, and ultimately it's the weight capacity of the truck that dictates what type of paving is going to be there. There's often desires for pervious pavement or turf block. The fire district's very picky about what they're willing to accept, and they require substantial documentation. So it's more of a code issue than an aesthetic issue. Now, of course, with paving, you can do textures and colors and do more interesting things to try and minimize the monolithic character of fire access.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so let's move to the proposed resolution. And this one is relatively short. So gentlemen, is there anything that we see on packet page 13? Any discussion, clarifications, questions? Okay. Turning to the next page. Any language, questions, second thoughts? My lawyer types? We're all good? Okay. Is there a motion to adopt the resolution?
I will move to go ahead and adopt resolution number 07-24. The resolution of the Planning Commission of the City of San Ramon recommending City Council adoption of objective design and development standards for the review of qualifying multifamily and residential mixed-use developments.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Curtis. Is there a second? Okay, Commissioner Ahmed is offering the second.
Just so we're clear that the resolution includes the Exhibit 1, which are actually the objective design
Yes.
standards. Okay.
Yes, thank you. And the exhibits as noted on the bottom of page 2 of 2. Thank you. So noted. All right, the motion has passed 5-0. So off to the City Council it goes. So thank you very much. Okay. Moving on to item number 11, study session, Commissioner liaison reports and interest items of staff. We have item 11.1, a study session on the Climate Action Plan update. We have Mr. Driscoll.
All right. Good evening, Chair Kuznick and Planning Commissioners. So as you may recall, the General Plan 2040 was adopted by the city in December of last year. In that document, there's some policies that require the Climate Action Plan to be updated. The Climate Action Plan is the primary implementation strategy of the city to demonstrate that there's a long-term greenhouse gas reduction emission strategy for the city, and also demonstrate consistency with state reduction targets for 2030 and 2045. So while the Climate Action Plan was originally part of the General Plan 2040 project, the city staff has continued to work on the project this year. Recently, we've received input from the Climate Action Plan Task Force that was recently formed by the City Council. There were 3 public meetings with the task force, and we received input from them. And based on the results from their input, red line edits were made to the documents that are attached to the staff report tonight. One of those documents is the draft greenhouse gas reduction measures list. And that measures list will form the basis for or foundation for the actual Climate Action Plan document that is going to be prepared in the next few months. Tonight, the bulk majority of our presentation is going to be from our consultant team from Rincon Consultants. We have Kelsey Bennett and Emily Saul here that are going to present and go through the slides, and I'll be back at the end. So welcome them up.
Evening, Commissioners. Good to see you again. Kelsey Bennett with Rincon Consultants, Environmental and Sustainability Planning Director, and accompanied by my colleague who will do the second half of the presentation, Emily Saul, a Sustainability Planner also with Rincon. So for our agenda for this evening, what we're going to cover is we're going to discuss San Ramon's Climate Action Plan, or CAP for short, as I'll just say moving forward, update effort, including process, scope, and overall planning steps. Summarize the greenhouse gas, or GHG, emissions 2019 inventory baseline and the 2030 and 2045 forecast and targets that are being used for the CAP update itself, and also share the draft GHG reduction measures, which are the core aspect of the CAP update document. So why is the San Ramon CAP being updated? Ryan already alluded to the start of this, is that it's an updated CAP is the main 2040 general plan implementation strategy for establishing the GHG emissions reduction strategy through 2045. And this is consistent with state targets, Senate Bill 32 and Assembly Bill 1279. In addition to the 2040 general plan mitigation measure, GHG-1 requires the city to adopt and implement an updated CAP that is also CEQA qualified. And the quick definition of what a CEQA qualified CAP is a CAP that provides substantiated strategies for reducing GHG emissions in order to meet both state and established local GHG reduction targets. It's to establish a framework for ongoing tracking of GHGs community-wide. And it's also a CAP that's undergone environmental review per the California Environmental Equality Act, or CEQA, as part of public review and the adoption process. So what is the purpose of the CAP update in general? So a CAP is a jurisdiction's plan for addressing climate change via reducing a community's GHG emissions levels. Overall, GHG levels contribute to continue to increase, and therefore they continue to increase in terms of threat to our health and our safety in our communities, and therefore CAPs are becoming more important than ever. State law requires that every jurisdiction reduce their fair share of GHG emissions to meet these state emission targets. And the previous CAP that San Ramon did meet the state GHG goals for 2020, and then therefore this CAP update will establish local actions to reduce emissions to the state goals, the next state goals of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and then ultimately to show progress towards meeting the state's ultimate carbon neutrality goal by 2045. And with the co-benefits of things like lower energy costs and reduced air pollution, The reduction of GHGs also helps to improve the quality of life for residents in the community. And so to talk about what is the scope of the CAP update. So a little Venn diagram here showing that basically after accounting for state and regional laws and programs that reduce GHG emissions on a larger scale, such as things as vehicle fuel economy standards and more energy efficient new development, the remaining amount of GHG reductions that are needed to achieve the community's fair share of emissions reductions guides the extent and the approach for city actions that are needed to occur to meet the targets, thus the local city actions in red on the diagram here. Those are the scope of the CAP. It's important to note that the CAP will address sectors that both result in GHG emissions in the community, as well as sectors that the city actually has the ability to influence. And so with that, these sectors in the CAP update will include things like residential and commercial, building energy, transportation, inorganic and organic waste, water and wastewater, and carbon sequestration. And that's where we work with nature to draw down GHG emissions from the atmosphere into the plants in the land. And finally, what are the climate action planning steps? So steps 1, 2, and 3 on this on this slide, we've done up through to before today. To give an overview, the city first starts with preparing an updated baseline GHG emissions inventory. And that for the baseline purposes of this CAP is the year 2019 emissions. And then the future emissions are forecasted through 2045. And those are based on current and projected land uses, operations, and population in the community and anticipated growth. And then the city determines and adopts the GHG emissions targets for upcoming years, including but not limited to the next state identified year of 2030. And then for the step that we are at currently today, then based on that delta that's needed to reduce forecast emissions to the target level, strategies such as measures and actions are identified for the various sectors. In this case, the sectors I just went through. And then the city, as the next steps after this current step we're in, they will identify funding and implement the measures and actions and based on the determined sectors and timelines associated with those measures. And then finally, the city would continue to monitor and track the GHG emissions and progress related to implementation of the CAP update itself. And now I'll turn it over to Emily to summarize the GHG inventory baseline, the corresponding needed reduction amount, and as well as the draft CAP measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey, and good evening, commissioners. So as Kelsey mentioned, the first step was to conduct a baseline inventory. For San Ramon's CAP update, 2019 was used as a baseline inventory year for which the forecasts and targets were then set upon. The inventory covers community-wide activities within San Ramon's geographic boundary over which the city has jurisdictional control or influence. And as you can see on this graph, the inventory consists of 6 main sectors or sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We have on-road transportation, which includes emissions from the fuel combusted to power the vehicles that move us. We have building natural gas, which are emissions from the natural gas consumed to power and heat our buildings. We then have off-road equipment, emissions from the fuel combusted to power equipment that do not drive on the road. These kinds of equipment include leaf blowers and lawn mowers, as well as larger construction equipment. We then have the electricity sector, which includes emissions from the electricity consumed to power and heat or cool our buildings, as well as electricity used to deliver water and treat wastewater. We then have the solid waste sector, which includes emissions from the disposal of solid waste generated by the community, and then emissions from treating wastewater. And in total, this results in 437,784 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MTCO2e. And as you can see from the graph, on-road transportation and building energy natural gas were the 2 primary contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 for the community. The next step, as Kelsey mentioned, was to forecast emissions through 2045. First, we forecast the emissions according to the business as usual scenario. This means we project emissions based on estimated population and employment growth. We then adjusted this forecast or these emissions to account for currently adopted state legislation that are going to reduce emissions statewide and also within San Ramon. These types of legislation include the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the Title 24 Energy Efficiency Standards, and transportation legislation, such as the Advanced Clean Cars program. And on the graph, you can see that the business as usual scenario, the dotted line on the graph, increases through 2045 pretty sharply. However, the adjusted forecast, represented by the bar graphs, plateaus off a little bit more through 2045. And you can see that in the adjusted forecast, transportation and natural gas remain the largest sources of emissions in both 2030 and 2045. Next, we set targets in alignment with the state's goals. These will be targets that commit the city or the community to doing their fair share of emission reductions. For San Ramon, these targets were set by taking the city's 2019 inventory and converting it to per capita emissions, that is emissions per person, and then reducing these per capita emissions in a linear pathway to net zero per capita emissions in 2045. And then, of course, translating it back to mass emissions, which you can see the result here on the graph. This resulted in a 2030 target of 332,995 metric tons of CO2e for San Ramon, as well as a target for net zero emissions in 2045. And this pathway, as in using per capita emissions to set it, helps account for the large amount of growth that San Ramon is expecting over the next couple decades. And you can see the gap between the adjusted forecast and the target line on the graph, so that is the shaded area. These are the emissions that San Ramon will be reducing through local action. And based on this, the city has developed a set of 7 strategies to reduce emissions to meet the 2030 and 2045 targets. These strategies include the ones that Kelsey previously introduced, as well as a cornerstone strategy. This strategy is meant to reflect the character and values of the community while contributing towards the 2030 and 2045 targets. And in addition, an implementation strategy, which will enable the CAP to be put into action in the community. And under each strategy, the city developed measures and actions. The strategies that we just reviewed represent the approach or represent the overall sector category for reducing emissions. These strategies then have measures which represent the approach for reducing emissions in that sector or category. They are measurable through a performance metric, and they're also set within a specified time frame. The measures then have actions or discrete steps San Ramon will take to achieve the measure's performance metric. These actions are supported by substantial evidence. By substantial evidence, we mean case studies or reports that show the actions can be implemented and that they can affect the measure or achieve the performance metric. And you will see there are multiple actions under each measure because each action is meant to address the pillars to climate action planning. These pillars summarize the types of steps needed to make a measure successful, and they include structural change, feasibility, equity, funding, education, and partnership. And as Ryan introduced, we met with the CAP task force to receive feedback on the measures and actions. Overall, the city was able to incorporate about 85% of the task force feedback into the measures and actions. And these revisions can be seen in the red line version that you have in your agenda packets. And just to summarize, some of the larger revisions from the feedback included adding a new measure on local solar and energy storage, adding actions to streamline permitting for smart panels and batteries, adding actions to translate the CAP update materials to top non-English languages, adding an action to create a public-facing climate dashboard to track and report on the CAP update implementation, And lastly, adding actions to encourage participation in the Cleaner Contra Costa Challenge, which is the county program to promote sustainable choices for community members. And as a result of these red line edits, the graph on the left shows where the CAP update measures will land with respect to the adjusted forecast in 2030. So once implemented, the measures and actions will reduce emissions to achieve the 2030 target. And the graph on the right, or the pie chart on the right, shows the breakdown of these reductions. You can see that about 46% of those 2030 reductions will come from on-road transportation, followed by 20% from natural gas building energy, 15% from waste, 14% from electricity, and finally 5% from off-road transportation. And for the sake of time today during this presentation, we're going to focus on the measures that, once implemented, will directly contribute to these greenhouse gas emission reductions in 2030 that you see in the pie chart. These are the quantifiable measures, and we will also focus on a couple foundational ones. The other measures are all supportive and are still important for the overall success of the CAP, and you can see those not in the slide deck, but in the red line, the full red line measures and actions document. So starting with the cornerstone measure, San Ramon's cornerstone measure focuses on conserving and managing open spaces, natural lands, and trail systems to increase carbon sequestration on these lands. This measure is supportive in the CAP, but it's important because it ties greenhouse gas emission reductions to the characteristics that the community cares about. We then have our building energy measures. These measures, so measures E1 through E4 are the quantifiable measures under the strategy. These focus on switching electricity consumption in San Ramon to MCE Deep Green. MCE, or Marin Clean Energy, is the community choice aggregator available in San Ramon, and it serves as a cleaner alternative to PG&E's electricity. And Deep Green is MCE's option for 100% renewable and carbon-free electricity. So these measures focus on switching electricity consumption in San Ramon over to that MCE Deep Green and electrifying both new and existing buildings. Of the transportation measures, measures 1, 3, 6, 7, and 9 are the quantifiable measures. These focus on, first, reducing vehicle miles traveled through active transportation improvements as well as public transit improvements. And second, converting the remaining vehicles miles traveled to zero-emission vehicles. The strategy also focuses on decarbonizing off-road equipment used within the community. We then have the waste measures. For these, W1 and W3 are the quantifiable measures. These focus on reducing organic waste sent to the landfill and applying that compost, the compost generated from that waste, to lands in the community to sequester carbon. And lastly, as part of the summary, we have the implementation measures. These are not quantifiable, but are critical to the overall success of the CAP. And these measures focus on educating and engaging the youth around climate action and supporting the city with staffing to implement, monitor, and update the CAP. And now I will turn it back over to Ryan Driscoll from the city to finish up with next steps.
So tonight, we're asking the Planning Commission to provide feedback to finalize the draft greenhouse gas reduction measures that have been provided. And a little bit on the CAP update timeline. The CAP task force is going to meet on October 30th to have an opportunity to review the cost memo that's going to be provided, which will provide some order of magnitude kind of a level of like high, medium, low cost estimates for the measures. And that same cost memo will then be provided to the Planning Commission on November 19th, tentatively. And then we'll have some future Planning Commission and City Council public meetings for the actual CAP update document itself, but not until the new year, in winter, spring next year. So I'll turn it back over to the commission.
Questions, clarifying questions for Mr. Driscoll or our consultants before we have public comment? Want to go to public comment
That
first?
we do public comment first, if we could, that'd be my preference for
Okay.
tonight, and then do our questions.
Are we all good with that? Yeah. Okay, excellent. So at this time, we will open public comment on this item. Do we have some speaker cards?
I don't have any speaker cards for this item, but I did receive written public comment from Servian Janist and VLAM West.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I do. Bob Peoples.
Bob Peoples. The microphone is yours.
Good evening. I am Bob Peoples. I appreciate the efforts to update the city's climate action plan. The draft material, which was referred to here this evening, addresses state requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I think there are other actions the city could take to adapt to and further mitigate climate change. I think two climate change consequences of particular relevance to the city should be addressed to both increase our resilience and ensure that we're prepared to adapt to a changed environment. Wildfire risks are already driving up homeowner and business property insurance costs. And I think that situation is only going to worsen, and we could experience some direct fire impacts are possible. The need to reduce the risk, that fire risk contiguous to and as well as in the city should be recognized in the CAP, and we should pay attention to some actions to deal with this. Secondly, due to climate change, excess rain events are likely to occur here. I think we've seen recently what happened in North Carolina because of Hurricane Helene. I think a formal assessment of the ability of the city's water management infrastructure to handle much greater rainfall we've experienced in the past, which will occur over short periods of time, should be included as a priority action to see, to make sure that it is capable of handling that. Regarding greenhouse gas reduction measures, rather than just having a support role, nature-based solutions to climate change can be quantified and contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as helping us to adapt to a warming world. A carbon sequestration feasibility report prepared for Contra Costa County last year indicates that spreading compost on grasslands can increase its ability to sequester carbon by 4,400 pounds or more of carbon dioxide per acre per year. If compost is spread on, a substantial portion of the open space owned by the city, as much as 6,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide could be sequestered by 2030, and 40,000 metric tons by 2045, based on the estimates that are in that county report. Usefully, this might also reduce the cost of disposing some 6,000 tons of compost that's going to be developed as part of the city's green cycle program. It could help reduce some of those costs. Maintaining the 8,700 acres of natural areas contiguous to the city identified in the Open Space Advisory Committee's vision document submitted to the City Council 2 years ago, as well as the substantial amount of open space in the city, would ensure that the carbon that has been sequestered there will not be reduced by development sprawling out into those areas. The amounts that could be of carbon that are protected, not released into the atmosphere, would have to be determined. But I think that there is a significant potential.
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up here pretty soon.
Yeah.
You're over.
And I would just say that planting more trees will also help to deal with this. And thank you for your consideration.
Thank you.
I have no other speaker cards.
Okay, thank you. We're going to close public comment on this item. All right, now, gentlemen, discussion, clarifications, questions. I'm going to look to my left.
Oh. So I have a question. So you're asking for, the funding comes after this is is the next step, correct? But you're asking for us to approve what you've given us without understanding the cost of that. Is that correct?
Correct. This is the first step in a kind of multi-stage implementation of these policies. So the measures will be incorporated in the CAP document that will be adopted, but there'll be future policy discussions and even some studies, feasibility studies on some of the measures to further flesh out some of that and determine what will be incorporated in those decisions for those policies.
Are there any penalties to the cities if they're not able to reduce greenhouse gases in terms of, let's say the city for some reason couldn't afford to implement any of these things? What type of penalties from the state or any other regulatory bodies would there be towards the city?
I mean, we have a requirement to meet the targets
I understand.
locally. I'm not aware of any financial penalties.
Can you come up to the podium?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand the consequences if you don't do it, what happens to the city is what I'm trying to figure out. So let's say we don't implement any of this, what is the impact to the city, consequences to the city not being able to do this?
There's grant funding would be one issue. The other would be CEQA compliance, because again, it's a mitigation measure for us. And so it potentially creates a need to do additional CEQA analysis on every project as opposed to being tied to a regulatory program. So bureaucratically, it would
So
slow
it takes a
down
little more time
and cost
and cost.
each
Okay.
time. And then there's also, as we mentioned, grant issues, but there's also potential for litigation.
Okay, very good. Thank you. On your presentation, number 7, has the total emissions of 437,784 MTCOEs. How does that compare to other cities in this area in terms of where San Ramon's emissions are comparative to, let's say, Pleasanton, Livermore, Dublin, or surrounding areas? Do we have any data on where we stand in terms of comparison to cities of similar size and similar environmental factors?
I don't have, do you have any?
Okay. I had one more question. Let's find it. The streamlining of smart panels and batteries. Is that something the city can just mandate all new housing just to put in? I mean, there's already a California law that says that you have to have solar panels on all new. Why don't we just have a mandate of storage as well, if that's one of the plans that we're trying to put into place?
Yeah, so there is discussion around building code requirements and furthering the requirements for new construction to meet solar or even battery potentially in the future. So that is one way that the state may in the future look at requiring it. It's not required now.
But could the city do that?
Yeah, and that's what this is discussing as a measure in policy to implement locally.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I want to go back to the cost as the next step, high, moderate, and low. When we talk about cost levels, what does that mean?
It's our consultant team's going to prepare it, and we'll have it shortly. But it'll give a overall idea of the level of cost. So it's not going to be a detailed quantified
Okay.
number.
Let me be a little more specific. Is it the cost to the consumer to be compliant? Is it a cost to the city to administer and implement? Is it cost to the trades? What do you mean when you say high, moderate, or low cost of these items?
You want to-
So the cost memo will include, it will describe costs to both the city in terms of, say, infrastructure costs, also like city staff time, and then it will also identify costs for community members in terms of implementing these measures and actions.
And then that'll all be folded into one letter, high, medium, or low, is that right?
Yes, that will be a memo.
Okay. Is there any, I assume at some point of the 25 to 100 recommended activities, I don't know if they're actions or activities, either the committee or the planning commission or ultimately the city council have to pick. I think I saw the language, our favorite ones to implement, although that was redlined and crossed out. But ultimately, we're going to recommend to the city council that you adopt some number of these things, right?
Yeah, the measures that are presented here, right, there's about 25 of them, I believe, are included in the analysis too that's been presented. So it's everything included. And so you need all the measures to meet the numbers, to meet the targets. So if one measure is modified or even removed or one portion of that measure, you're going to need to make up the greenhouse gas reduction in another area.
So every one of the measures is required in order to implement. So if there's one that either we can't recommend to city council or the city council chooses not to adopt, we won't make our reduction targets. Is that?
It'd be difficult. Yeah, it's a narrow pathway to meet the
Okay.
targets.
I might recommend that we have more choices then before it ultimately comes through, because some of these may not be amenable to implement ultimately. So there might be other options you may want to suggest that we have. When it comes to the cost, is there any metric that's going to be provided that says the specific benefit to it? And I'm kind of imagining cost per metric ton reduction or something so that we can pick the best of the best, Does that play into these measures? Sometimes I saw measures that had a number associated, sometimes I did not.
We can discuss. We don't have the actual CAP document prepared yet either.
Okay.
Talk a little more to our consultant team.
Okay.
There isn't right now identified, benefit for each measure, but we can see if we can look
Yeah.
at doing that.
Just prior to recommending to the city council, I think if we're trying to be as effective as possible, cost per unit of reduction, it might be helpful for us to, actually move forward with recommendation. I have some specific questions, but maybe a broader question. I see the word reach code a few times in the document. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, it's a term to mean locally you can adopt a ordinance that would require higher additional requirements beyond state building code. Typically, it's around building code requirements.
Okay.
And so the threshold, the local requirement would require further requirements be met than what
Okay.
the state law requires.
Does that imply that there's no building code that will address this area, or we're choosing to adopt it in advance of when the industry will be moving to it, or?
Could be both.
But could be both.
Yeah, I mean, currently there isn't a state law in those areas, but there could be in the future addressing that.
So if we decide this is a good thing, does that imply that we're then taking on the role of defining building codes that generally the industry would define, that we're going to do it locally? Is that
The city can adopt ordinances that
but do they have to create them or do they already exist?
you'd have to create them.
We'll have to create them. So we'd be
Yeah.
suggesting that city staff or city staff plus consultants would be doing what the building code industry would generally do.
Right.
Okay.
Often there are standards that are voluntary standards that are listed in the codes that will ultimately become code. And what the REACH code does is it goes forward and adopts them now. So we're able to capture the benefits of those things in the near term rather than waiting for a 5-year code cycle or whatever the next
Okay.
code cycle is. It's actually touching on Commissioner Curtis's comment earlier in terms of adopting a local standard that exceeds the current building code requirements. But that comes with a cost and impact as well.
Okay, and then that'll be captured in the cost memo, I assume, of doing this in advance of.
Yeah, I think
Required.
it's key for the REACH codes. They would provide an opportunity, as Lauren was saying, to capture those additional reduction in greenhouse gases earlier than the potentially a state
Okay.
law would
Okay.
require.
Okay. And just like, for example, packet page 81, adopt a REACH code in 2026 requiring all new residential central air conditioners, et cetera, et cetera. So does that imply that we would adopt something in 2026, but the industry has, or it will be actually implemented in a requirement if we don't move forward with the REACH code by, say, 2028 or 2030 or 20 never?
It's unknown,
Okay.
unknown if it would be done beyond that time frame.
Okay, okay. I think personally, in order for me to recommend to city council that we adopt a REACH code, I'd like to understand a little bit more about the cost and the benefit and the risks of doing something such as this, because it's not quite clear, or at least in the report, what the, I think I can probably see, as Lauren said, you might be able to capture benefits sooner than what the industry would require, but I don't get a sense I have an understanding that I think I should have of what are some of the risks, of us doing this or not. So the final report, I think it would be helpful for us to have something like that to put forward. I think I'll yield the rest of my
Okay.
time.
Commissioner Almond?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. It's, I have to sort of echo the comments made by some of the commissioners here. Is sort of the whole, so we have these targets, but we don't know whether we have the money to achieve these targets, correct? And if you're gonna recommend a target, it may just be futile because there is no cash to do so. Is there a plan is to raise a bond, get a bond to implement this? Have we discussed, have there been discussions about where the money is gonna be coming from? Are these realistic, unrealistic targets, given the finance money needed to do a certain target? That's one thing. I guess it's sort of premature for me to sort of, without knowing if this is, a realistic goal. Second, my comment is that what are the timelines? I know there's a target of 2030 and 2045. And as we have construction going on, we have a 7-year target of 5,000 homes under the housing element. How do we sort of implement these targets to current constructions now or 2 years from now? I don't see those target or timelines. I see a big target of 2030, but how does it impact construction that starts today, construction that starts a year from now, 2 years from now? Make sense?
Yeah, so I'll take your second question there. I think if there's a requirement related to a building code or building permit, like a REACH code is adopted prior to that project that was entitled, then is getting building permits, then they may be subject to that REACH code requirement. If that's what you're asking.
I'm just asking overall, just not about just the REACH code.
Yeah.
Just, like, how do we, so some more specification in terms of timelines? For the construction starting now, we need these done right immediately, or 2 years from now, we need these done.
Well, the implementation measures have dates. When it talks about adopting a REACH code by a date, that's what that is referring to.
But they're not here, right? Are they here?
They're in there, yes.
Some of them are, right? Not all of them.
One thing that I would mention is part of this process is going to be looking at, a bang for the buck, for lack of a better term, and return on investment. Obviously, the major sources of greenhouse gas generation are vehicle trips and building energy. So there are things that we can do under building energy that actually makes economic sense in the current environment. I'll give you an example. Under current building codes, you're allowed to do gas or electric systems, but you are actually required to install both infrastructure. And so the development community does not want to pay to install both of those infrastructures. So they only do the electric. So the residential development you're seeing now is primarily electric only because they're subject to the current building codes. And it doesn't make sense to pay the extra money to run gas lines. So that's a business decision that they're making. So if we were to adopt a REACH code that just prohibited gas in that type of situation, it would have little or no impact because the people are doing it anyway. Now, where it will have impact is on single family and individuals who then have to
Go back
come up
and-
to codes as opposed to new construction. So existing construction is going to be much more difficult to deal with than new construction.
So if someone is remodeling a home and putting a new kitchen, you won't approve a permit till it's electric stoves, for example.
Well, they right now they have the choice, but if we were to adopt a REACH code, they would have to go to the additional expense
By then, okay.
of doing that until such point in time that the industry catches up with it and they become cheaper to install electric. It's just a matter of supply and demand and that transition to the cost. But right now, it's more expensive to install heat pump water heaters, and HVAC systems and the like. And so that cost has to be absorbed somewhere. And so those are going to be decisions that the council are going to have to make and how we want to manage that. The other opportunity is, while it's a little bit of a long shot, there are grants available, funding sources to help with these things through the Air District, through the state as well. And so however we choose to implement these programs, we'll be looking for funding opportunities to help subsidize our community in meeting these targets.
Okay, thank you. Return.
The largest greenhouse gas emissions are due to transportation, over 60%. As I understand the report from the consultants, there is no actual measurement of greenhouse gases actually off by citizens of San Ramon, but it's basically a black box where there's a regional model and numbers are plugged into it, and out pops a figure for each of the municipalities. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. They're
Okay,
using
and,
a
this is
regional
going to be a generic question, so if the consultant wants to tackle it, that's fine too. With respect to San Ramon, what are the top 2 or 3 drivers of what is calculated to be our greenhouse gas emissions for transportation?
Go ahead.
So one of the activity data for transportation emissions is
You're going to have to speak up here.
the activity data for transportation emissions is vehicle miles traveled.
Yep.
And most of those emissions for on-road transportation are coming from passenger vehicles. So
Yep.
those are sedans, light-duty trucks, things like that.
No, I get that. I mean, I get that that's how you calculate VMT, and if you have VMT, you can probably roughly calculate the greenhouse gases produced by the VMT, although I'm not sure you can produce it to 6 digits to a single number like you have. But my question is, when you're trying to calculate VMT for people in San Ramon, what were the main drivers to come up with that calculation?
So that calculation is based on the regional travel model made by the MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So they made a regional travel demand model for the Bay Area region, and it's delineated amongst the jurisdictions.
So basically, they come up with a formula for the entire Bay Area, which includes 9 counties, and then they somehow apportion a portion of it to San Ramon?
Yes, but it's a model for the 9 counties, and they're ground truthing that data in traffic counts. So we can't measure where everyone moves all the time, but we're making a model for how we know and assume people move, and then using traffic data from cities to make sure that model is accurate for the jurisdictions, or as accurate as can be. And then the second part of the calculation is coming from the emission factors, as in the fuel efficiencies of the actual vehicles moving around. That data comes from state models as well.
Well, that last figure is sort of generic to a car. It's not specific to a municipality.
Well, it's
but-
based on the makeup of vehicles within the municipality.
Sorry?
It's based on the makeup of vehicles within the municipality.
So you have a DMV printout of what cars are being driven in San Ramon to figure out what the average mileage is?
So it's also coming from a model. It's a state model, and DMV data does feed into that.
Okay. So it's basically a guess.
It's a model.
Yes, that's what a model is. It's basically a guess. And the question is the calculations used to do that guess accurate or not? One of the things that was brought up was going to all electric residential and commercial buildings by 2026. And I thought that Mr. Barr's explanation was the best one I've heard as to how that is possible by requiring developers to install both gas lines and electric. You basically give them a Hobson's choice. You really have to pick one because you don't want to do two. That was an excellent explanation. So one of my questions is this. In order to replace gas-fired furnaces, gas-fired stoves with electricity, you're going to have more electricity than you currently have, correct? Okay. You need to come up here so we can record your answers. Okay. So, what are the top 2 or 3 sources for the additional electricity that is going to be needed to heat and cool our homes through electricity only?
So that is not necessarily something that San Ramon has to plan. The state is doing that, like at a state level. They are looking at the projected electrification rates and looking at the, where electricity needs to come from and what the demand is going to look like. So that's being done on a state level and on a utility level.
Okay, so
Sorry, through the chair, I would also add that storage of energy has become a major challenge. We have a lot of solar, a lot of generation during the daytime, but how we store it is increasingly a priority.
I know, and that's a little farther down my question list, actually.
All right.
So, so we passed the job on to the state. So, as it currently stands, what are the top 2 or 3 means by which the state proposes to meet the increased electrical demand that is generated by having houses and commercial buildings heated and cooled only by electricity?
So the state has, under the renewable portfolio standard, as well as every utility has to do an integrated resource plan every couple years. The state is already planning how to do that through renewable sources. And we're looking at solar and wind, or the state is looking at solar and wind, as well as geothermal and like a little bit of hydro, but mainly in-state sources.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the state, not you, the state is placing all its bets on wind and solar because there aren't that many geothermal locations that provide electricity. The hydroelectric facilities in California, as you know, are limited. We haven't built a dam in this state in over 30 years. We just managed to tear down 4 in the Klamath River. And climate change basically has made the variable of water supply, which drives the hydroelectric plants, iffy in certain years. So are you saying that the state is putting basically all its bets on wind and solar? And if so, where are they going to put all the wind turbines and solar panels?
I mean, there are going to be large-scale solar and wind, as well as more community-level solar, which is when you think about solar on rooftops.
Besides solar rooftops, we put some wind turbines in San Ramon?
This will still be a decision or planning under PG&E, as well as marine clean energy. And we're still going to have, rather than wind and solar, which are not consistent, reliable electricity sources, there's still going to be a switch and buildup of more reliable, steady sources, such as geothermal.
There's no way that you can pump up geothermal to do what you're trying to do. They've been trying to do geothermal in California for many years. It's just not that significant a portion of what it is. Now, let me talk to what Mr. Barr mentioned, which is electrical storage. When you talk about electrical storage, what is the primary means that you're looking at in terms of storing electricity?
Can you clarify that question?
Yes. What are the primary means by which you're looking at storing electrical energy?
So there can be There's going to be storage or meant to be storage on large scales, as well as you can look at storage at more of a community distributed level in people's homes or in commercial buildings.
Okay, and how are they going to be stored?
So batteries is a very common one, as well as a emerging or already cost-effective strategy can, for example, be more creative solutions like EVs. Now manufacturers are making EV batteries be two-way, so you can also use your EV as a way to store electricity and pump it back into the house if needed.
Okay. Now, I assume the batteries you're talking about are lithium-based batteries?
For the most part, I'd say that makes
Okay.
up a lot of the market now.
And you're aware that lithium comes from basically two sources, a desert in Chile and in Australia, and that almost all the lithium that is mined is processed in China?
For the majority of the market, yes. There are also still additional startups in the US.
So has there been some type of market risk as to what the problems would be if one of those supply chains were disrupted, such as China decided not to send more lithium batteries to the United States, or there was a revolution in Chile that stopped lithium production, or at least production for us?
I would not say that's a risk assessment I have done,
Okay.
but batteries are longer term.
Through the chair, you're raising points that are beyond the scope of our control in this case. I don't disagree that there are some challenges with the programs and the context in which these standards are being set, but we're in a position of having to respond to state mandates and come up with a strategy for doing it. So I'm not sure that, talking about the availability of lithium batteries in the future is within our scope at this point.
Well, it would be if that is your long-term strategy.
But it's not necessarily 100% our strategy. We're relying on the state to hold up their end for the statewide impacts.
Well, I guess we'll just have to rely on the state, won't we? They're doing such a good job for us already.
Again, I can't comment on that right now.
I know. There's a phrase that's used in your report that's basically one of the phrases is equitable implementation of energy strategies. What does that mean?
So especially as Lauren had mentioned, especially with existing buildings, to electrify existing buildings, you're going to be distributing costs on community members. And the idea is to do it in a way that is equitable, as in for people living on low and moderate incomes, we don't want to be burdening them with higher installation costs or energy bills. So it's to make sure we continue to monitor the incentives that are out there, which there are already, both regional incentives through programs such as BayREN and Clean Tech to provide rebates for electric water heaters and heat pumps, as well as there are already federal and state level incentives available. So it's going to be, continuing to monitor the policies and the implementation to make sure we're not burdening community members living on low and moderate incomes with these actions.
Does that basically break down to subsidies to certain groups?
That is definitely one opportunity, yes. And not necessarily, it's regional and state and federal subsidies.
One of the things you pointed out, this came up in the terms of the master bike plan, was that your package at page 77 talks about looking at roadways, which is existing vehicle roadways, for converting to active transportation corridors. Now, as of this time, have any such roads in San Ramon been sort of flagged for potential conversion?
I'll pass that back over to the city.
Are you aware of any? What I was going to say is we have policies that relate to complete streets that talk about providing infrastructure for multimodal transportation. And those types of projects are sort of uniform throughout the city in the future, typically with new construction that we would do that. But I'm not specifically aware of any currently designated.
No, nor was I. I mean, there are streets that are like that from time to time. The cities close off streets. JF Kennedy Drive in Golden Gate Park has been closed for years to vehicular traffic so they can have pedestrian traffic. But when they talk about putting roadways to go into the core area, there's three streets to do that. There's Crow Canyon, which of course is one lane now. Bollinger, which is pretty much one lane now, and Norris Canyon. So I was just, it seems to me that sounds nice, but given the geography of San Ramon, it strikes me as being unrealistic regardless of the cost.
I think the challenge is really about how one might transition to these things and whether it's something that's done as a uniform you know, project type situation or gradually over time. I don't disagree that some of the major arterials are not really subject to this type of change, but some of the other collector streets could be. Yeah, but again, I think it has to be reflected in the way that the use patterns have changed over time.
Right, and I agree with what you're saying, in that the point to the streetways, what they're talking about, is getting foot or bicycle traffic into areas where people want to go to actually do something. Like in San Francisco, sometimes they shut down streets like in the Mission and so forth, where they have shops and they have restaurants to enable people to walk or ride their bikes to an area to actually eat or do something like that. In San Ramon, that doesn't seem to me, at least at this point, that's a feasible possibility in our lifetime, but maybe they'll surprise us. Last question. One of the measures you talked about had to do with water recharge. That was in your WW package. And I happen to be a believer in subsurface storage of water, but I'm not aware of any place in San Ramon where that's done on a non-natural basis. In other words, we might have a detention pond where the water filters down, but I'm not aware of any man-type situation where we pump groundwater back into the ground. Do we have anything like that in San Ramon?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, maybe our sanitation district will have some ideas on that. So that's all the questions I had.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions and thoughts on this as well. I'd like to start my question. If we go to today's presentation, page 11, strategies, measures, actions, and then it talks about pillars. And I'm just wondering, how were these 6 items, how did we get to that these were the 6 ways that all of this was going to be managed? What was the thinking on that?
Sorry.
So the pillars, the 6 pillars we have listed here, they were developed in collaboration with the city and also from Rincon's experience with making climate action plans across the state. We found that these are really the 6 types of steps that are needed to make the CAP implementation successful. So really, go ahead.
So when you say in collaboration with the city, what in the city? The Climate Action Task Force, random people, city council,
With
staff?
the city staff during drafting of the measures and actions.
Okay, and Mr. Bard, what department oversees this? I'm just, as we were looking at staffers.
Well, in terms of the production of the CAP right now, it's primarily with planning, with input from the other departments as well. What I would say about the pillars is it comes down to best practice, and it's also, as she mentioned, was based on other jurisdictions that have gone through climate plans and gotten the support of Air District and state standards in terms of making it a qualified CAP for purposes of relying on it for environmental and other issues. So a lot of this is not unique to our community. These particular pillars are things that are being promoted statewide.
Okay, all right, very good. So another major question I had, particularly as we're looking at vehicle miles traveled and reductions through that, is yes, you described a model that has been used. Does this model account for traffic that is coming from Danville and then to Dublin on 680 24/7. Are we responsible for all that CO2? I mean, as it buzzes by?
I would defer to our consultants on it, but I believe there's a prorated pass-through traffic is adjusted for throughout the entire model because again, it's not unique to any one community.
Yeah, so that's correct. No pass-through travel, as in trips that start outside of San Ramon and end outside of San Ramon. Those are not accounted for at all within this community inventory. 100% of trips that start internally and end internally are accounted for, and 50% of trips that either start outside or end outside San Ramon are accounted for. So those trips that either start internally and end externally, start externally and end internally, 50% of those, so they're prorated, but no pass-through.
And does that, when you were describing the model, you also said that there's an accounting for what cars are in San Ramon. It seems to me like we have a very high percentage of electric vehicles already. Is that accounted for already?
So that is accounted for in the, we'll say, the emission factor of the vehicles. And that data is incorporated into the state's model and also comes from DMV data.
So as we are building many of these new developments on a daily basis, we have people moving into brand new residences. How is that accounted for in these projections? In terms of all of these areas that need to be adjusted?
So I guess it's still accounted for in the overall model. And the model is specific to the county and run for San Ramon. So it might not be on a building by building basis, but it's still a high level look at the city.
Okay. Going to some of your the measures and the reductions. On packet page 77, when we talk about measure E2, decarbonization 100%, can you just review for me what the definition of decarbonizing 100% is? Because this is a big deal.
Carbon neutral.
Yeah, it's to be carbon neutral. There could be other ways than just electrification in the future, but so that's decarbonized would capture potential future technologies.
Okay.
If I can break in there, you're talking about E2, right?
Yes.
Okay, it sounded to me where it says decarbonize 100% of new residential and commercial construction by 2026. That is basically what Mr. Barr pointed out, was that given the codes now that require, if you're going to put in electricity or put in gas, you also have to have as a backup electricity. No one's going to put in both. Well, I shouldn't say no one. Few are going to put there. So it's carbonization by dollar cents.
Got it. Okay, thank you. On E4, it says electrify 5% of the commercial buildings by 2030, and then it jumps to 48% by 2045. That seems like a big leap. Is there a reason why it accelerates so dramatically in what seems like a short amount of time?
Well, I think we can, part of it is what the target needs to be in order to meet our goals. But the other part of it is when you look at the useful life of buildings and when people are reinvesting into the infrastructure of a building. So, I mean, you've seen it in Bishop Ranch where some of the older buildings are torn down and new projects are being built. It's a similar thing with when you're looking at retrofitting existing buildings. There's a point at which it makes sense to reinvest in the building, and those are the opportunities to upgrade the buildings to higher standards. And so, again, we're a relatively young community, but as we get farther out, there'll be more opportunities as older buildings need upgrading.
Okay. And then at the bottom of the page, measured T4, where it says emphasizing resilient housing construction. Do we have a definition for resilient housing construction?
We don't here, but that's something we can look at for the CAP document.
Resilient housing means housing which is efficient and sustainable. And what they're talking about, resilient, is a little more dense, but also more efficient in terms of use, electricity versus gas, things like that.
But you can also look at it in the context of climate change as well. So this would be an argument about, fire-wise situations, being resilient to wildfire. We're not dealing with sea level rise here, but those types of things are also part of the resiliency efforts.
Okay.
Climate adaptation.
Yes.
Okay, on page 78, when we get to waste, measure W2, reduce the carbon footprint of the food system by reducing waste. The question that I jotted when I was reading this is, does this include all the food systems in the school systems in our town? And who owns that as a responsibility?
I'm not positive about this, but I would argue that they're not subject to our regulations because they're their own district. But I would have to talk with some attorneys about that to be sure.
Okay, as a person who watched lots of food go into the garbage on a daily basis, I would say let's get on top of that one. All of us have to kind of keep our waste under control. And finally, I am going to take this moment under carbon sequestration, measure CS1, which is talking about, I know you redlined the planting the new trees. I would like to go on record to remind people once again, my frustration when we continue to issue tree removal permits for these new developments, and that we already have a multitude of carbon sequestering living organisms that we are just chopping down. So I would like to have the committee really embrace that, and let's see what we can do about fixing that. So I think that we already talked about a REACH code because I asked the same question in terms of my comments on the code. I do have serious concerns about issues as you read through this when it says assign the staff to and so forth. I think that you're asking us to look at this now, to give you feedback. It's going to city council. We have an election in 3 weeks that really holds the fate of the city in terms of staff availability, what we can and cannot budget for. It might be a more prudent moment to say, let's see what happens here before we commit to this part that says, have staff do this, have staff assigned to this, have staff do this. I would suggest that you guys are probably feeling a little stretched as it is without additional items.
Well,
coming
I think,
forward.
I think that what they're talking about is they're doing a cost memo, right? Which is to basically what it's going to cost to implement some of these strategies. Presumably that will include a cost for a sustainability climate action person position, things like that. I think a lot of the issues that they're proposing may shake out once we have an idea of what the resources are in the city of San Ramon to deal with some of these issues. So, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but if you look at the schedule they're talking about, this is not going to go to the city council until next spring. We're going to have a couple of meetings to thresh through this. We'll probably have some numbers to talk about at one of the subsequent meetings, and then we can start gnashing our teeth at that point.
Yes, but I think just to be clear, we do have a climate action task force that have willingly come to this committee, and that this ought to be something that perhaps we shift more in their direction as opposed to simply saying designate staff time and municipal funds, designate additional staffing. So time will tell. Yes, Commissioner Wallace.
Yeah. I have
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner Albert.
I assume at some point we'll have the 25 items and we're going to either recommend they all move forward as is or modify it or something. And I want to just reiterate again that in order to meet our goal, we have to implement all 25 of them and hit the nail and hit the estimates of the savings. I don't think that's a good plan for success. I think, you know, when you have 25 and you have to be 100% right on all of your estimates in order to meet the goal, you're taking a pretty big risk. So I want to emphasize again, we need more than just what's been presented. Secondly, I'd like to make the comment that, no, if you want to respond, that's fine. Go ahead and respond.
I just wanted to add that like any planning document, technically, even once you hit milestones of adoption, it's a living document, right? So technically, it's like an equalizer in your stereo. If as being tracked by city staff, task force, whoever everyone in the city deems as the tracker long-term of the cap, if certain sectors or measures are becoming apparent that they're not being achievable for whatever reason, there is ability, and you don't even have to wait for a full cap update, that staff or that task force could make adjustments real time, you know, after each year to do more of certain sector reductions or less. And I just wanted to throw that out there, that there's almost like an envelope of all the reductions that you would need to be doing to achieve the targets, but there's flexibility technically in your plan as you track it over time, which is part of being a qualified cap, to track it and monitor it to make adjustments as needed. I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, thank you for that. Although I would just counter that there's a target number in 2030, which is not very far away. So there's not a lot of time to adjust, readjust, you know, twist the dials of, you know, we're going to do more of this and less of that. That's why I think it's really important that there are plans in place to exceed the 2030 target, so that if something either misses or city council chooses not to adopt some of these 25 items, we still have at least a shot at doing this. But given that the first milestone measurement that's been presented here is 2030, and 2030 is not very far away.
I appreciate the suggestion, and actually, based on comments about, you know, wanting to add the tree planting back in, or maybe increasing a couple of the different, you know, measures or sectors by sector. It wouldn't be the worst idea, I agree, to aim to go a little bit beyond the required 2030 target as almost like a caution flexibility that what you're getting at there. So, but I mean, that is up to the overall deciding body
Right.
and everybody. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay. Given that transportation is one of the biggest drivers, I see a couple of things here that when comes back before us, I think we need a little more details. So for example, T6, increase passenger zero emission vehicle adoption by, I think it's 30% by 2030. Kind of leveraging on what something Mr. Barr said, how do we do that? How does the city do that? You know, what are some tactics that the city can actually adopt, implement, or something to actually increase passenger zero emission vehicle adoption? You know, and perhaps when the plan comes back, having some of those things in the plan so that the city council can actually see what it is that they are actually, when they say we're going to do this, there must be a way to do it.
Yeah, one way is to require EV charging in multifamily home developments, and also look at providing additional information to residents about incentives, other things that might be outside the city. Yeah, it can be difficult because the city doesn't have the direct impact as much on transportation as we do sometimes on building and building energy.
Right. And yet transportation is the biggest pot to work on. So
particularly with EV
I just think that it's only fair that when we say in order to tackle the biggest slice of the pie, You know, we can't just say we're going to increase the adoption without having, and we're going to do that by doing these things, you know, and like you said, you know, for perhaps, you know, making it easier to charge your vehicle might cause people to buy more of these vehicles. I don't know. But I think it's only fair that they have things like that, you know, or we have that so that we can feel good that we're making a recommendation that one of the ways we're going to meet our 2030 target is through this specific measure, and this is what the city is required to do, you know.
I think, yeah, as Ryan stated, making opportunities for an infrastructure for EV vehicles more accessible is one thing. Education, making the public aware of what opportunities are out there, the benefits. But of course, at the end of the day, it requires that you have cost-effective vehicles that make economic sense to you know, move forward with it. So part of it is educating the public on that issue and how we get there. Of course, we have the state 100% EV vision, we'll call it. And so, you know, we're heading in that direction. But, you know, this community has been very open to electric vehicles. And so to the extent that we can support some of the infrastructure, I think that's probably the best way to encourage it. And then, of course, the city has the ability to make decisions about how we purchase city vehicles and city equipment.
Right. And I see that as another option in here. Anyways, trying to avoid the, you know, we need to fix the lithium mining problem of the world, you know, give that to city council. Anyways. And then lastly, on the reach codes, that I think I've already made the comment, but I think I just want to reiterate. I think that it needs to be a better understanding of what it means when we say we're going to adopt certain reach codes. And the one that just comes to my mind, and you know, I don't know if it needs a response or not. If I came home tonight and my water heater was leaking all around the garage, I would call a water heater company and I'd have a new water heater by tomorrow. And if I can't do that at some point because of a reach code and the plumbing industry hasn't figured out how to do this, are we asking our residents to live without hot water while they get an electric one or go get a loan or apply for a grant or get a service panel upgrade or a smart switch, or what are we asking our residents to do? And I think before we put that in front of the city council to adopt, we at least need to understand the ramifications of that. It's one thing to remodel your house and have to not go to Friedland Appliance and pick an electric stove instead of a gas stove. It's another thing when you have a catastrophe at home and you don't have a choice anymore. So I just want to make sure that we're going into these things fully understanding the ups and the downs of this. Sure.
I would just clarify one other point. These reach codes are a local standard. There's also other provisions that are being put in place by the air district, such as prohibiting the sale of gas water heaters and other gas appliances within the Bay Area region. And so you may not have a choice unless you're going to drive out of the region to buy your gas water heater in the future. So it's going to become an industry standard at some point, and there will be a cost associated with it.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'd like to think that when it's a wider adoption and requirement, then the industry and the public will be ready to deal with this. Again, you know, just concerned that if we're doing something independent or ahead of, you know.
The transition is always the hardest part. So.
Okay, we have given you lots of feedback, so thank you. And I think we will see this again sometime soon-ish.
Yes, we'll be back on November 19th.
November, okay.
For the cost memo.
Election will be over. We'll know what the fate of the budget here. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. It's a complicated issue, and I know you guys are spending a lot of time on it, and so we wanted to be equally clear in the feedback we were able to give you at this point. Thank you. Okay, also on item 11, Commissioner Liaison reports. Do we have any? Oh, goodness, we're all shaking off that one. Okay, excellent. No updates on that. Does the staff have any updates?
I'll just talk a little bit about calendar.
Okay, thank you.
So as you're aware, November 5th is election night, and we are canceling that meeting. So you can enjoy your events and things. Hopefully. November 19th will be the next meeting. As Ryan mentioned, we have the CAP update. And then we have a couple of other projects that are floating. We're not 100% sure. There's a monopole for AT&T that's going to be coming through. We also have the Bishop Branch 1A Park that will either be at that meeting or the following meeting. And then there may be a couple of other study sessions that are in process in the next couple of meetings as well. So we'll formalize that schedule, but we'll most certainly have a meeting on November 19th.
Anything else for the good of the order? The good of the commission? All right, well, thank you for all you who attended tonight. We appreciate it. Staff, again, thank you. Good job. And I will gavel us out.